topic of terror, a stunning admission by President Obama claiming he never knew about the ISIS threat during the group's early days.
The rise of the Islamic State surprised you. It took you by surprise. It took the administration by surprise.
The ability of ISIL to initiate major land offenses, that was not on my intelligence radar screen.
Not on his radar screen? Really? Even after being warned by his predecessor, President George W. Bush, about the consequences of pulling U.S. troops out of Iraq.
To begin withdrawing before our commanders tell us we are ready would be dangerous for Iraq, for the region, and for the United States. It would mean that we'd be risking mass killings on a horrific scale. It would mean we allow the terrorists to establish a safe haven in Iraq to replace the one they lost in Afghanistan. It would mean increasing the probability that American troops would have to return at some later date to confront an enemy that is even more dangerous.
And what about President Obama's own administration officials who said this?
Syria has become a huge magnet for extremists.
Its current leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is a designated global terrorist under U.S. law and we believe is currently based in Syria. His mission, as clearly stated in his own statements, is to carve out a zone of governing territory from Baghdad through Syria to Lebanon.
The scale of what they are involved in right now, particularly the al-Qaeda element in Iraq, and just the level of destruction that they're having, the level of killing that they're doing inside of that country is terrible.
All right, Eric, so despite all of these repeated warnings directly from the previous president to President Obama, his own administration officials, including you see General Flynn there making these comments and giving that testimony, fell on deaf ears.
So a young Senator Obama from Illinois with no foreign policy experience comes in, he's president, and he's probably shocked by and overwhelmed by what's actually going on. But the problem is he didn't pivot. He didn't listen. He didn't hear his generals. He didn't hear the prior administration and change his policy. He stayed with, we're going to close Gitmo in my term or first term or second term. We're going to do these things. He would never said Islamic extremism, never use those words, and tried a friendlier approach to combat ISIS and terrorism instead of going strong and hard. At least we have a new president-elect who's listening to the prior president. He sat down with Donald Trump, sat down with Barack Obama and said, what's going on? He's listening. He's actually listening to some of the people who are at high-level jobs within President Obama's White House. So I think Donald Trump is doing things differently from the way President Obama did things when he walked in. And by the way, it's got to be overwhelming to first hear about all the stuff that's going on.
Oh, absolutely. All right, Greg, you're shaking your head.
He shouldn't be listening to President Obama. That's absolutely crazy. Look, he said it wasn't on his intelligence screen. Well, there's an alternative. It's called the television. He could have turned it on because we were talking about this. We were talking about this while they were still playing down the threat of ISIS. The reason why President Obama did not admit that this was a problem was for two reasons. One, he hated the source. He has a problem with adversarial criticism or even adversarial advice. If somebody from the other side says, dude, look out, this is a problem, he goes, well, that's Fox News, or that's Dick Cheney, or that's George W. Bush. Screw him. And also, the second part is he didn't want to offend. He has that constant, Islamophobia phobia. He realizes that if he starts talking about radical Islam, he's going to piss off a lot of people. This will go down as President Obama's singular, massive blind spot. It's like his drug problem. It's like when you go and you approach somebody and you say, I think you have a problem, he will consistently deny it to the very end. ISIS is not a problem, radical Islam is not a problem, and none of the people in his inner circle were willing to do that intervention that is necessary to say, dude, look at this stuff, it's real, people are dying, and now we're at a point where they're everywhere.
POTUS, dude.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm talking as an interventionist, trying to help him.
And he doesn't want to hear about it, but the thing is now you see that people that have served his administration are starting to come out, tell the truth about what's been going on, and we're going to see more about that, and he's going to have to live with his legacy, and unfortunately he's left ISIS on our doorstep. Taya, again, welcome to the program. I want to thank you and your family for the service, the sacrifice, and your husband, what a heroic, amazing American soldier. So thank you from us on the 5. So get your thoughts, because you know better than anybody, having having somebody that has served right there, you know, in the field, trying to deal with these situations and these issues, and then you have a president who, despite the info and the intel from the field, chooses to ignore it and also modify rules of engagement, which makes it much more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a concern that he says it wasn't on his intelligence radar. I think that might be a slight way to pass the buck to the intelligence community, but we can obviously see that that wasn't the case, that he did have the information and he chose not to believe it. I think that that could come, I don't want to psychoanalyze him too much, but you know, based on his actions in the past, I think we can assume that he doesn't have a whole lot of high regard for his military or his high-ranking officials. You know, his Secretary of Defense was a guy with in physics rather than military, which is fine, except that, again, it shows that he's not really respectful of generals, I think, that were leading in the fight. So, having said all of that, he would rather believe that we are overstating things, that it's not as big a problem, that we don't have to worry about it that much. Like you said, he's really worried about offending people that are peace-loving Muslims, you know, who belong to the religion of Islam, instead of even calling them the extremists. So I do think that part of this is just him not wanting to admit it, and then maybe he really legitimately was surprised, and he didn't know that those terrorists could gather up and overtake a major city in Syria. Maybe he didn't think that they were that serious, but he certainly has learned that they are.
He certainly has found out the hard way. All right, Juan, what do you make of this situation?
Well, I just want to have us, you know, touch down near reality someplace in this conversation. Because what Obama said to Fareed Zakaria at CNN was, we're flawed, we make mistakes, we're human beings, but did we make the best decisions with the best information available? And he believes that he did. And what that best decision was to say that American intelligence did not give enough credit to what he was calling the JV, and that's been much mocked at this table and elsewhere on Fox. But the reality is, and he points this out in the interview, for those of you who want to go read the transcript, he says, look, there was no way to anticipate that Prime Minister al-Maliki would pursue such a sectarian agenda that would absolutely alienate the Sunni Muslims and then drive them towards that al-Qaeda. Secondly, he had no way of knowing what was going to go on with Bashar al-Assad, the brutal dictator now in Syria. And, of course, we could talk about red lines and all the rest, but again, we're talking about a real human being. That wasn't at the time, Eric. No, I'm not. I'm not sweeping it. You're ignoring realities in order to mock Obama.
He said if they cross this red line, we're going to go to war, and then he didn't do it.
That's not the period he's talking about. And then finally, he talks about something Greg talks about every day, which is the propagation of terrorist agendas on social media. And again, Obama is simply saying, these were not elements in place at the time, Eric, at the time he's talking about, which afterwards. And finally, one last point. So everybody at the table says, oh, but President Bush told him. President Bush told him. What President Bush told him was he didn't want to withdraw the troops at the end there. He said, you know what, this is going to open the door, as you just heard in the sound. But what President Obama said was two things. One is, and by the way, General Petraeus, he doesn't listen to generals. Everybody loves General Petraeus. Petraeus said, there's no guarantee we would have had added leverage by having 10,000 Americans in harm's way on the ground at that time. And what President Obama said was, unless we can get a deal from al-Maliki that protects the rights of our troops, doesn't subject them to being prosecuted, tried by Iraqi courts, we're not going to play this game, and there was no guarantee that it would have stopped al-Qaeda.
Can we start with the failure at Benghazi? Can we start with the failure at removing Gaddafi? Can we start with what could be perceived as failures throughout the Middle East of removing people who you may not agree with their ideology, you may call them dictators, but in the absence of that, when you bring in these factions of al-Qaeda, these factions of radical Islam that are going to fight for power, we're left with a more dangerous Middle East every single time.
Because it's been destabilized.
Name me one.
Are you talking to me or are you talking to George W. Bush?
Name one. I'm not even.
George Bush is the one who took out Saddam Hussein.
I'm not defending what George Bush did either. But do me a favor. In the last 8 years, name one country that you feel is safer and we have a better relationship with now than we did prior to Barack Obama, besides Iran and Cuba.
Besides,
well, I'm waiting.
I think that Israel, our primary ally in the Middle East, is safer today.
You do.
Because we have a deal that has stopped their number one.
You could be the only person in this four-block region.
How about in the world that said, you know what, this is a good deal to stop them from having nuclear weapons? How How about the people coming into Trump's own administration?
But you're speaking on behalf of Israel, and I'm so sorry to tell you that Netanyahu completely disagrees with you.
But
he knew that was a bad deal. It did not make Israel one of our key allies safer. It compromised our relationship with them. It compromised security and stability in the Middle East.
There aren't any countries that are better off, Juan. There aren't any countries that are safer, and we have a better relationship with.
I think, well, one, I tell you what, the United States of America and our military, young men and women who had to be on the ground, they're safer. They're not in harm's way.
I'll wait.
The one thing, I know that we are going after President Obama, condemning him for abandoning the red line, which led to the migration disaster, which led to an increased worldwide ISIS threat. He chose a path that isn't much different than what we're hearing now, which is non-intervention. There are a few people at this table, by the way, who are saying don't do anything on Syria either. So you can't just say to him, he screwed up by not backing up the red line, because there were a lot of other people that felt that way. The longer-term thing is, how are we going to reconcile with a belief system that disrespects the idea of a secular solution? The only way to keep these religions from destroying each other is a secular answer, and it ain't going to happen with Islam. That's the long-term fear that we have is lack of assimilation. And the problem with President Obama, lastly, is that he's the one that is conflating radical Islam with Islam. When you talk about the threat of radical Islam or ISIS or al-Qaeda, we're not talking about Muslims.
No.
We're talking about radical Islam. However, when it comes to him, he goes, whoa, you know, we don't want to, we're not tarnishing an entire religion. Well, we aren't. You are.
Exactly. Let me get to Ann before we have to jump. I mean,
no, I totally agree with that, especially on the religion point. You know, we were talking about it earlier today, that you could say the KKK could say that they are all for Christianity and they represent Christianity. We know they don't. And I'm okay as a Christian, passionate about Christianity, to say, yes, they're claiming that, but they're idiots, right? They don't represent me. And I think that we need to do the same thing with radical Islam, is be okay with saying, you know, that's fine. Islam, Muslims, like, we understand that there are a lot of peace-loving people in those groups. But this is a different group. This is a hate group.
Right. And along the same note, and I think you're talking about me when you said about going into Syria. I was against going into Syria. Absolutely against it. I still am against us getting involved in Syria. However, it's either go or don't go. I'm behind you, President, if you go. And we're all behind you. Or I'm behind you if you decide not to go. However, when you say, if you cross this red line, we're going to go, and then they do and you don't, you've just confused.
He doesn't back anything up. And guess what? President-elect Donald Trump isn't even in the White House yet. He makes a claim. He backs it up. Look at the example.
Why do you have to ask the Congress? Why does the Congress say, oh, don't go? They refuse to authorize it. Gee, Republican majority Congress.
All right, Juan. That's just about enough.